Today I want to start a series about practical security implementation for M365 tenants. It goes without saying how important cybersecurity is in our data and so on, and we've got security advice and frameworks coming out our ears, but sometimes these frameworks are not practical in their implementation, and if you truly follow them to the letter, then your business won't function at all and you'll have some angry users. So I want to start working through the CIS 8.1 critical controls framework, see how we can apply it to our tenant in a practical way and still have our users working while achieving a solid security baseline. So why does this framework over some other framework like SOC 2 or ISO or NIST or some other baseline that I just made up myself? I think it's really, for me, just because I hear it talked about in the industry across more industries, so therefore it's well recognized. I think it's a good solid standard to start from, and without boring the crap out of you, I'll just quickly jump over and introduce you to what we're going to get started on, and then we'll dive into it. So I'm going to provide you this direct link in the show notes so you can cut to the chase and just download the framework if you want to, and that will skip you past having to hand over your username and so forth and email address. You can download the PDF here, and I'm not going to read it to you, but essentially CIS, they're vendor agnostic, it's industry led, both volunteers and institutions, and they've come up with this framework. So why reinvent the wheel? Let's just use this. It's a good one. I'm not going to bore you with the rest. I have also downloaded the Excel, so we'll jump over to here, and these are the controls that we're going to work with, and you can see there's a lot of text here, so I'm not going to read that text verbose. We're probably just going to look at the titles here, and I'll try and explain what we're trying to achieve with each title. And so in that case, without further ado, today we're going to focus on section 1, and we're actually going to focus on a level IG1. So you can see over the right hand side here, there's IG1, IG2 and IG3. IG1 is the foundational, and really for me the minimum level that you should be looking to achieve in a small business. Okay, so finally I've also got more or less a blank tenant, so let's jump over into that tenant, and I've also got this handy tool, Cloud Capsule, and a shout out to Nick Ross from T-365 and the Cloud Capsule team for creating this tool. Essentially, Cloud Capsule is going to help me take those security controls from CIS 8.1, and you can see that here, and there's another framework in this CSF which we could benchmark against. Let's ignore that for now. That's just going to help me benchmark my tenant, and bear in mind this is more or less nothing's been done in this tenant. So let's filter in here on IG1 and take a look at those controls. So you can see that the control number 1 that we looked at in the spreadsheet about establishing and maintaining a detailed asset inventory, and bear with me on this terminology here. Asset for our purposes really just means laptops, workstations, mobile devices, tablets, that kind of thing. And to meet this first control we need to keep them in an inventory, and in the Microsoft world this inventory is either Azure AD or Microsoft Intune. So simply by virtue of living in this environment, and you can see here in Azure AD, if I go to devices, and I've got a device from a previous demo that we did in here. So I've got a device in there, it's intra-joined, and therefore our devices are in an inventory and we're meeting that control. Now you might be thinking, hey, what about devices that aren't intra-joined and they are accessing our environment? And that's really where the control 1.2 comes in, which is addressing unauthorized assets. And handily, again in Cloud Capsule tool, they've identified some ways in which we can address those unauthorized assets. So let's take a look at how we can control those, and we'll start making some policies. So let's start addressing these unauthorized assets, and handily in Cloud Capsule they've given us 3 sort of controls that do absolutely speak to that, and the first of which is managed devices shall be required for authentication. And what that's really saying here is that our devices will be enrolled in Entra ID and or Microsoft Intune for management, and that's what we're going to let access our environment. And what's not going to be allowed to access primarily is BYOD devices. The reason why that's really important is because BYOD devices are typically, they don't have the management of your corporate IT infrastructure. They're the personal user devices, and they're the soft underbelly, if you will, of devices that can access our environment. So let's jump over into Entra and take a look at some implementation here. I'm going to get out ahead of some practicality, as I mentioned before. So I'm going to go to groups, and I'm going to create a new group here for BYOD devices, and I know I literally just mentioned BYOD devices being the problem. If you follow along in the series, I'm going to create some conditional access controls or some limitations on BYOD devices to make that experience limited, less friendly and less exposure, and therefore hopefully encouraging those users over onto our managed device option. But let's have this allow BYOD group. I'm going to put no one in it, but we're just getting out ahead of it in terms of our conditional access controls. So that's done. Let's jump over into protection, go to conditional access, go to policies, and we'll create our first policy. So this policy is going to be require managed devices. And if you're not a managed device, then we're essentially going to block your access. So we'll come down to users, we'll apply it to all users, and this is the second caveat I guess I want to call out, or first, depending on how you read the way I'm talking. Most organizations are going to be in a situation where they share documents with guests or external collaborating companies. So for the purposes of where we're at the moment, we're going to exclude guests, and immediately you're probably realizing, but doesn't that defeat the purpose, because they're also probably one of the highest offenders or riskiest attack vectors? And the answer is yes. So again, follow along in the series, and we're going to address guests in a separate policy. So for now, I'm going to exclude guests, and I'm also going to exclude the group that I created for allowed BYOD devices, which is really not an issue because there's no one in that group. So let's add that, and then add our target resources, which is going to be all cloud apps, or it's now just called all resources. And then we're going to have a condition. So we're going to exclude from our block policy the devices that are intra joined. So let's have yes here. We're going to look for an exclude. We're going to look for trust type. So our trust type is going to be equals to intra joined. And I'm also going to have an or condition here. So it could be trust type of hybrid intra joined. Now, if you're in a cloud only situation, this is not going to be applicable. You only need one. But just for those businesses that have still got Active Directory and they're joining their devices that way, let's have intra hybrid joined as well. I'm not going to have registered. For me, registered is not managed enough. And there's reasons for that, which we'll also see later in the series. And that's really it. So we'll come down to our grant control, and we're going to actually block access here. And for the purposes of this video, I am going to leave it in report only, but I'm also going to exclude my user from this policy. This would typically be, you'd exclude your break glass account, or strictly speaking, as the administrator internally of this business, I would be using a managed or intra-joined device to actually create these policies, so it wouldn't be an issue. But of course, this is just a demo tenant, so I'm not using a device that's joined to this tenant, but I will create some virtual machines in the rest of the series, which we will access the tenant from, so we can see the impacts of these policies. So let's create that policy, and really that's pretty much it for control number 1. Okay, so control number 2 is about personal devices and keeping them out of our MDM solution. And for me, it's also about keeping them out of our Entra ID tenant. If you're an IT administrator like me, you will have seen tenants with hundreds of registered devices of people that are long since left, and they really shouldn't have been there in the first place. And if you've got people registering new ones, then it becomes difficult to decide what to delete and what to block and so forth. So let's just create a policy to prevent people adding them in the first place, and then slowly it'll become clearer to clean up the ones that you've already got, which you'll see in control number 3. Let's jump over into the tenant. There's a couple of prerequisites or things that I've actually already done. I've created a group here called allowed device registration via TAP, and that means temporary access password. So go ahead and create that group. I've put no one in it for now, but just understand that in terms of our workflow, what we're going to do is we're going to put people into that group when they're going to register their device. If they're not in their group, they're not going to be able to register their device. And the second part that I want to show you in terms of prerequisites is under authentication strengths. I've gone ahead and enabled this temporary access pass, and I have allowed that group to use temporary access pass. And then the final thing that I've done under authentication strengths is I've created a new authentication strength called TAP, and that the authentication methods under that are the temporary access pass methods. I'll quickly show you. If you create a new authentication strength, give it a name and tick these couple of boxes. I don't need to save that because I've already done it, so I'll just cancel out of that. And that's our prerequisite setup. Before we set up our conditional access policy, I wanted to point out some defaults that Microsoft has around joining Entra ID, and potentially something you could do that's a little bit less cumbersome, but I think not as secure as a control. So under devices, if I can find that, there we are. So under devices and then device settings, you can see the default settings are extremely permissive. So all users can join devices to Entra. They don't even have to MFA, and they're allowed 50 devices each, which weirdly goes against Microsoft's recommendations. They recommend a maximum of 20 devices per user, which is still mental. I would probably say let's knock that down to 5. Your average user's probably only got 2, maybe 3 devices. So let's have 5 as the maximum. They should require MFA, I think. And so if you just change those 2 settings and set this to selected group, and you could potentially use that same group that we created before, and you could add people to it temporarily, then that mostly keeps devices out of Entra join and therefore out of your MDM solutions. That probably meets the security control that we're talking about, but it's still going to allow this registration in the mess. And that's why I'm steering away from this way of doing it, but it is a way of doing it that I think meets the control. So let's jump over to the conditional access policy then and look at what I think is a bit more secure, but yes, it is more labor intensive for your IT team. So you decide which way you want to go. In our case, let's have a look at this. So we're going to require TAP. Sorry, let's say registered devices, registered device, require TAP. Okay, so we're going to target this at all users, and we're going to for target resources, we're going to change this to user actions, and we're going to choose register or join devices. And then you can see that the only thing we can do from here is require MFA to register devices, and that's fine with us because we're going to require a specific type of MFA. And you can see in this grant controls, I have really no other options. So we're going to have require authentication strength, and the authentication strength that we're going to require is a tap, and it hasn't actually shown up in this drop down list here. And the reason for that is I only created that authentication strength maybe half an hour ago, and with the authentication strengths, like many things in Microsoft world, it seems to take an age, especially when you really need to get it done, for it to actually show up. I guess it's converging in the background. So I'm going to update this policy probably offline or maybe in a later video, and I'll come back and show you that it's updated. But if you're having the same problem, then just come back the next day and hopefully it's appeared. So for now, I'm going to just choose multi-factor authentication and hit select and hit create. And once I come back and change that to require tap, then we're good to go on that control. And that's it for control number 2. So the third control about addressing these unauthorized assets is about the devices that have managed to get their way into our Entra tenant or MDM solution, and they are just hanging about. They've not checked in for 30 days, and potentially this is an attacker just sitting there waiting dormant, and then they'll, if you just leave them there a couple of months after the actual breach occurred, let's say, then the attacker might strike. And oftentimes they'll do that as a way of waiting for your backups to sort of expire. So let's address these devices that haven't checked in for 30 days. There's 2 places that we need to check, and one is in Intune and the other is in Entra Auth. So the easy one, let's jump over back into our tenant, and I'll go to the Intune portal, and we can actually have Intune clean up our devices automatically, which is nice. So if I go into devices, and I think it's somewhere under here, I'll just search for it, I think. Yeah. Let's search for it. So device cleanup rule. So let's have a device cleanup rule. We'll enable that and we'll turn that on for 30 days. And awesome, we're now meeting that policy. Or simply by having the control, I mean, I guess we're not meeting the policy, but by having no devices that haven't checked in for over 30 days, we're meeting the policy. Now, annoyingly, Entra ID, I was already in Intune there. Okay, let's go back to Entra and we'll go to devices. And I mentioned that device that I had from a previous demo. So let's go see that. And this device hasn't checked in since October last year, so we're failing that policy. And annoyingly, Entra doesn't have a way of automatically cleaning these up for you as of recording that I'm aware of. I could just write a script and run this periodically, but in the simplest term, I can come into all devices and sort by the last activity. And of course, I've only got one device here, and anything that falls outside of 30 days, then I can just go ahead and delete it. So let's go ahead and delete that device out of our tenant, and that's really it. So I guess in your environment, either create a script that runs periodically or create a recurring ticket or a recurring calendar invite for yourself to come and check this. A lot of these controls, if I'm honest, do require periodic checking on things manually, and that's the nature of security. It is a journey, it's not a destination. So I've reran my assessment of the CIS baseline against the tenant, and what's great is these things here have turned green, and there's a couple of things I wanted to call out. And one of them is that because we deleted our device, I now have no devices in my inventory, so I'm failing this control. So what I've done is I've created a virtual machine and I've joined it to the directory, but in doing so, I ran into a couple of gotchas or caveats. I wanted to call them out in the interest of keeping everything practical and applicable. So we're going to build out this tenant and test the user experience as we go along. And the main thing is that in my conditional access policy, I turned them on, and of course, to turn them on, I have to disable security defaults. It's a brand new tenant, so let's quickly jump over to security defaults. If under the tenant overview, under properties, you'll find down here security defaults, and obviously the link's changed because I've already clicked this, but you can, that link would take you to security defaults, and then you disable it. So I've already done that, so I can't show you that, but just know that it's under properties and down the bottom there under security defaults. The second thing is when I was trying to log into the machine as my user to get the machine set up, the conditional access policy that required a already joined device ultimately blocked me. So I'll quickly jump back to that conditional access policy. So conditional access policies, when I disabled security results, it created the Microsoft managed policies, which are best practice. So I have some overarching MFA policies, and just leave those on. They're good practice. We're going to build on those policies. That is a absolute minimum baseline. So here's the first policy we created for required managed devices, and under the users and exclusions, I added an exclusion for the allowed device registration tap group, and my user, Joe user, is in that group. So that has enabled me to actually join the device. So I just wanted to call that out. The assessment's finished, and you can see that I'm now meeting all the controls of IG1 section 1 for the enterprise assets, and in the next video we'll look at the software assets. That's all I wanted to cover today. Thank you so much. Until the next one, catch you later.